What is up, everyone? We're back with another Scottcast. Today, we are talking about the fact that the NFL players don't actually give a shit about their own union. Yes, shocking. I know. Rich millionaires with one of the most powerful and well funded unions in the history of anything union related don't actually care about what they're doing or the good they're trying to do. So, this story has been wild. I've been covering it and talking about it with friends and anyone who will listen to me. I'm like, dude, you have to look at this stuff. It's actually absolutely insane. So today, just a super quick Scottcast for you. Welcome back, everyone. Episode 3. As you can see, there's going to be no consistency on what the content is or the length of the content or how good the content is, but very much appreciate you sticking with us while we try to figure out how we want to do this and how we're going to be successful in doing so. So anyways, today we are talking about the reporting that Pablo Torre and Mike Florio of Pro Football Talk were doing regarding the NFL Players Association and the dealings of now former executive director Lloyd Howe as well as Chief Strategy Officer JC Treader. This story is so interesting, and I'm going to try to keep it as condensed as possible because if you haven't heard much about this story, then you're probably living under a rock. But this has been one of the most entertaining things. And I think it highlights not just like greed, the typical, corruption scandals, greed and, power and backroom dealings and stuff like that. But, I've said at the beginning, we're dealing with the NFL Players Association. The NFL is a almost $1 trillion business at this point. Not really, but you take into account all the evaluations of the teams, plus the revenue that they're making and the power that they have. We're getting closer to $1 trillion than we are $1 million. That's for sure. When we're looking at this, we have the most powerful players association on the players association, the most powerful union in the history of anything ever. This is one of these stronger. You see the dock workers strike. This is nothing on it. They have billions of dollars in cash reserves from years and years and years of people buying into it. And as you'll see, this is kind of what played into problems later down the line. Anyways, cut it short here. Going back to the beginning, reports start trickling out from Pablo Torre, and I have all of his videos up here, all 3 of them. And videos start coming out about this grievance that was filed. And anyone who's been following the NFL knows that guaranteed contracts have been a huge sticking point for both players, for both owners, and there's been a lot of back and forth on it up until like 2 weeks ago. Every single second round pick in the NFL that from this year's draft wasn't signed because it was a fight over guaranteed money. Once one got signed, they all kind of the dominoes fell. But you look at contract negotiations like the Russell Wilson contract, which is part of this whole story. But the catalyst of it was the Deshaun Watson trade and signing. Deshaun Watson got a fully guaranteed contract. Looking back at it, and I'm sure the Players Association hates this, but the player they had to decide to start this precedent with ended up being the biggest piece of human garbage in existence. Not categorically, but he is up there. He was a piece of crap. But he ended up kind of setting the precedent on fully guaranteed contracts. So what had happened was, after that, the NFL players, the owners got together and they said, this is ridiculous. We cannot be affording to pay out guaranteed money. It's always been a battle between guaranteed and non-guaranteed money. That's the one leverage that the NFL has that other leagues don't see as much of, is this guaranteed money battle. In the NBA, contracts are all fully guaranteed. And you look at the NBA, players have an incredible amount of power. So the NFL's been really good at limiting that, but as we saw with the Deshaun Watson contract, is that power was it was diminishing. They lost the first fight ever for a fully guaranteed contract of that size and magnitude. Well, obviously, the owners get together and they say, well, this isn't sustainable. They want some non-guaranteed money just in case for things like injuries, arrests, just anything really. They want to be able to cut people with more ease and The players on the other half are saying, our average career length is 4 to 5 years. We're out here running into each other head first, giving ourselves lifetime generational trauma to ourselves. We'd like at least the contracts to be guaranteed. So it's been a contentious back and forth. Long story short, the NFL's Players Association files a grievance and says, hey, and that's what any union and labor labor organization can do, is they can file a grievance, and they said, hey, we think that there's collusion going on when it comes to guaranteed money. So they do this, the NFL and the Players Association commission this third party to go investigate this. This investigator comes out and he files, I forget, it was like a 62-page report, I believe the number is, about what had happened, and he found areas of collusion. Most notably at the owners' meetings, the NFL went out, and I believe it was Roger Goodell himself gave a presentation on guaranteed money and how guaranteed money can have an adverse effect to the league and then the long-term financial standing of the organization, the NFL. So, and then they also dig up text messages between the owners. The Kyler Murray contract is a big one. That was one that was gonna be fought over for guaranteed money wise. There's text message exchange going on between the owners of the owner of the Chargers and owner of the or general managers. I believe it's owners or general managers. I apologize, I don't know the exact details, but people in the front office of the Chargers texting back and forth with the people in charge of getting the Kyler Murray contract done. Kyler Murray gets signed, and they go, hey, and I'm sick of seeing Mike Florio's face, so I'm just gonna switch to Twitter here. But they go, hey, great job on that contract. You really did a good job limiting the money. And they also say, this lays the foundation for us to get our guy done at a better price. And their guy being Justin Herbert. So those two pieces of evidence were considered, and there was also part of the Russell Wilson, were considered the main evidence for this collusion. And this is what the third party had found. They partially win. They have a partial loss as well with something else that happened with J.C. Treader, who was at the time president of the playing president of the union, then shifted into the full-time chief strategy officer, my friend Lloyd Howe. But anyways, they get this document in their hands, 62 pages, that basically confirms collusion on guaranteed money. This document never sees the light of day, ever. No one knows it exists. You must be wondering why. This is a tremendous piece of leverage that the Players Association has over teams. Publicly, they could have leaked it. They could have sent it to anyone, done anything to get eyes on this. What had ended up happening was that the Players Association agreed to bury the document. And you're wondering, well, what could that have? How is that in the players' best interest? Well, shockingly, it's not. So what had come out was this man, Lloyd Howell. And Lloyd Howell is so interesting to me because he's just a typical, I don't know how to explain it, but he's not what you see as the Players Association guy. He's like the investment bank guy, like the high level executive types. Backing up, and this is just, I'm jumping all over the place here, but you have to know who Lloyd Howell is and how he got hired to better appreciate the context I'm about to give about what he had done to bury this document pretty much. So, we jump back to 2022, 2023. The Players Association, at the time playing president was J.C. Treader. He was playing for the Browns. He got cut from the Browns, and it was pretty obvious that he wasn't going to get signed again. You can't serve, obviously, on the Players Association board without being an active member of the Players Association because you're not a player. But at the same time, you could also get hired in one of these full-time roles. So what had happened was, while J.C. Treader was still in office and still had his position, they actually were going ahead. They were interviewing for new executive directors. Well, it turns out they decided that they wanted to change the rules on how you hired an executive director. Before, there was a clause in the whole contract of how you go about doing this process where all the players, all the voting partner players, all 32 of them, would have to have like 60 days of advance notice of who the two candidates or the whole group of candidates were for the position of executive director. They can do their research. Obviously, they're working out in the off season. They're doing all these things. They're pretty busy. This was a way of notifying them, hey, here are the candidates. Go do your research and come back to us and we're ready to vote. Well, they decided that that was unnecessary. They decided you weren't going to know who you were going to be able to vote for until you walked into that vote. One, very sketchy. Two, what? And the argument was if we were going to attract the best talent possible, then we have to be able to keep these searches confidential because these are people who are still employed. And I'm a recruiter by day, so I actually somewhat understand this justification. At the same time, I also don't because it's the NFL and the NFL's Players Association. I wouldn't be surprised that the President of the United States would want to interview for this job. It's literally one of the biggest, strongest, I guess it's strongest union, one of the most it is the strongest union on the planet. It is the most well-funded union on the planet. This is the ideal job. Anyone would want this job. I'd take this job in a heartbeat. My dog would take this job in a heartbeat. The President of the United States would take this job in a heartbeat. The President Putin would take this job in a heartbeat. Anyone would want this job. It's awesome. So having your name thrown in the hat and being considered interviewed for this position, I don't necessarily see that as something an active employer would be too upset over. Whatever. That was the excuse they used. So they get to this vote, and Lloyd Howe just runs away with it, gets hired. But this isn't a man who is without scandal. His company that he worked for, which I believe was a private defense contractor or someone who did a lot of contracts with the government. Well, they just had to settle a lawsuit before he got why he was the chief financial officer of this multinational company, worked with the government for like $152 million because they were defrauding the government. They were actually writing up more information and charging the government more than they should have for these contracts they were working on. So, and chief financial officer, by the way, as if he didn't understand that. And there was a whistleblower at the organization that brought this to Howell and his team. And Howell said, this is not going to be a strategic priority for us moving forward. And then, lo and behold, the person was no longer at the company. So, this is the man who did that. And there's also a lot of other questions about this man. Long story short, he gets the job. But then it turns out there's a couple of weird things going on with Lloyd Howe. First of all, he has a part-time job at a private equity company. Okay, fine. But turns out that private equity company is the same private equity company that just got approved to buy shares of NFL teams through a whole bunch of negotiation, because this has been a huge sticking point for the NFL. They did not want private equity in the NFL for a long, long time. I think they finally bent the rules just a little bit to allow some very small amount of private equity to come in so teams can raise capital if they need to. And guess who one of the approved private equity companies were? Well, it happens to be the one that Lloyd Howe's a part-time employee of. Interesting. Okay. So long story short, all you really need to know is J.C. Treader was a huge proponent of hiring Lloyd Howe. Lloyd Howe gets hired. One of the first things that Lloyd Howe does is he opens a new position within the NFLPA called the Chief Strategy Officer. Guess who he hires for it? Because his buddy was no longer eligible to even work for the union because he was no longer an active player. Well, boom, guess who gets hired to that role? J.C. Treader. So J.C. Treader is now sitting at as the chief strategy officer. So now all these things start coming out. The fact that this document existed comes out. Some other things comes out. There's an FBI investigation about another deal that the NFLPA did at the time. There's all these moving parts, and at the end of the day, it ended up being, J.C. Treader decided to step down. He denied pretty much everything. Oh, by the way, this guy also expensed trips to the strip club, which he did at his old job too, and he got in trouble for. But he expensed to the Players Association trips to strip clubs. Pretty expensive trips too. Nothing absolutely outrageous, especially for how well funded the NFLPA. The NFLPA isn't going to go broke over this, but he was expensing trips to the thing. So, so sure, this guy's a Class A scumbag. Let's be honest here. Lloyd Howell is not a good person. So this all goes through. Lloyd Howell resigns, pushed out, whatever you want to call it. All this information starts coming out. Well, it came out, then he left. But at the end of the day, the big thing that I want to talk about, I didn't nearly get into the details as much as I wanted to, but I just love recapping the story stupidly and jumping around because the story is just insane. There's so many moving parts. I highly recommend you watch Pablo Torre's 3 podcast with Mike Florio on. There's the first one, which is Collusion Gate, which goes over the documents that they got, as well as just some of the intricate details there that kind of led to the chain of events. Collusion Gate 2, they got another union document that was buried, this time showing how J.C. Treader was reprimanded for that the owners actually won a grievance filed against the union against J.C. Treader for telling running backs that they could sit out during negotiations and just pretend that they're hurt, which is a clear breaking of the CBA, clearly. So that goes into that. And the third one, which I just listened to the other day, was this really convoluted deal that the NFL Players Association did with this team called One Team, I believe, One Team, and about selling players' rights and just a whole convoluted mess that actually ended up with an FBI investigation because we're looking at players and it's a whole convoluted mess. I'll link these because you have to watch them. The whole thing is absolutely insane. The last thing, the key thing I really just wanted to hone in on is what the hell are the players doing? The players clearly do not care about what is happening in their own union. There was this tweet circulating at the time, and it was saying that it was just a list of all the things that J.C. Treader and Lloyd Howell were, over the past couple of weeks in reporting from Pablo Torre, were like guilty of. And it was saying all these players are, they had a call between the 32 player reps, and everyone was asking for them to be recapped because they had no clue what was going on while this reporting was going on. They had an emergency meeting and they just had no clue. All the players were like, "Wait, what's happening?" And then there was a tweet circulating that all the players were sending around to each other about what had happened, and just Cliff Notes version. It's alarming, but is also understandable about how these players just don't know what's happening in their own union. They're paying all these union fees. The union has millions and billions of dollars in cash laying around. They're doing these intricate, like that. You saw that $10 billion deal. They're also advocating for private equity groups in the background and doing all this shady stuff. The players need to get a grip on this. Again, I understand that Patrick Mahomes isn't going to sit down and read document and give intricate insights into what's wrong with the CBA and things like that. I get that. That's not his job. His job is to throw touchdowns and get beat by the Eagles in the Super Bowl. But there's got to be players who are willing. If you're going to be a voting player rep, it came out that one of the huge people against kind of what this was going on when he was an active player at the time was Richard Sherman. And Richard Sherman was a huge pushback on a lot of these things. Not these things specifically because he wasn't an active player, but when he was the voting rep, he was really involved in these conversations about these grievances and really knowing what's happening. The players need to know that if they're gonna be electing 32 player advocates or player whatever representatives to kind of oversee the operations of the union and kind of, I don't want to say to regulate, but to keep an eye on what the actual full-time employees of the Players Association are doing, then they have to be people who give a shit. They have to be people who care. They have to be people who are informed. Because this is crazy that you're on a call with the 32 player reps, and they don't know what's happening, and they need a recap, when the past month was just direct and just ripping apart of these two people at the head of the union. So, long story short, this is definitely not where this ends. This is only going to get crazier. This story is absolutely outrageous, but I still wanted to just talk about it a little bit. I know I probably didn't do the best job of recapping it, but it has so many intricate parts. Again, I cannot recommend this article by Florio is great. Just kind of recapping where we're at and kind of how it's dealing with the fallout. And then start with these videos, though. These videos are insane. Again, I know they're long watches, but they're incredibly entertaining. They have so many good details here. And it's something that if you're a fan of the NFL or fan of football, then this is worth your time in the off season because it's just so interesting, and it's also got that that footballness to it where they're talking about contracts and backroom deals with owners and just things like that I just find super entertaining. So that's it, everyone. Thank you for this super condensed version of the Scottcast. Hope you liked it. If you did, please like, subscribe, comment, whatever you think, and then I will catch you on the next one. Hopefully, a new video coming soon. See ya.